All right, morning everyone. Apologies for the late start this morning. Obviously security running a bit late this morning and not unlocking our room is a bit annoying. But we'll make the most of it. We'll get there hopefully relatively quickly. What we're going to talk about today is engineering ethics. Collective groan. Engineering ethics is sometimes considered very dry subject matter, and I could give you a lecture full of why we use ethics and things like that. We're going to do case studies today, a couple of different case studies, and you guys are going to start to interact with ethics, because ethics is actually incredibly important and fundamentally it protects you guys. Alright, so ethics is something that is a tool that you guys can use to protect yourself and make sure that the engineering that you're doing adheres to what your own moral code says, but also what Engineers Australia says, and we'll get to that. Alright, so once again we're sitting right there in the second learning outcome of sustainability and ethics. What are ethics? Anyone? Sorry, when you're using morals, yeah, your own personal morals. Anyone got anything else on that? Yeah, so what's right and wrong? Anyone else? So ethics is, applying your own personal morals to what's right and wrong. What is right to do as an engineer? What is wrong to do as an engineer? In what circumstance can you say no? Because as an engineer, absolutely you can say no to particular things, and that speaks to the second one. Why does an engineer need a code of ethics? So I would assume all of you have your own moral compass, your own set of personal ethics, things that you are and aren't happy to do. Don't steal, don't hurt people, don't kill people, etc. That's, right at this end of the spectrum. But back from that, there's right and wrong. Don't, copy someone's work. Don't, that kind of stuff. So that's little personal ethical decisions that you guys make every day. Why does an engineer need a code of ethics? To make it universal? Yeah? Anyone else? So a code of ethics really protects you, right? I have printed out, and it is on the Learn JCU as well. I think I have about 100 copies here, so you guys can start circulating these. There's probably about 100 of you here today, so that's about right. This is the Engineers Australia Code of Ethics, and you guys, as engineers graduating from a program that's accredited by Engineers Australia, this is your code of ethics. Alright? You, as an engineer working in Australia or with the degree that Engineers Australia calls an engineering degree, this is the code of ethics that you need to live by. And the purpose of having a code is such that everyone's working on the same ethics. Everyone's working on the same moral compass. This should represent what most of you already have, but it goes into more detail. And the most important thing is, as an engineer who's signing on the dotted line once you're, certified or whatever, if someone comes to you and says, hey, can you go and build this particular thing in this village over here, don't worry about the inhabitants, they're paying you to be an engineer. This protects you because you can say, all right, what you're buying is an engineer, and I as an engineer have to stand by this code of ethics. That's part of my certification. And right here on 2 point whatever, that's not going to be possible within my code of ethics. We're going to have to find a different way to do it. Now, there's two things you can do when you're talking to a company. One is flat out reject them if they're asking you to do something really morally wrong. The other is to work out how to frame what they want to achieve within your code of ethics, and that's much more likely what you'll be doing. So you'll come back to them and say, all right, well, we can't knock down all of the trees and just displace the village or whatever. Well, what we can do is perhaps solve it this way, okay? But your code of ethics gives you a starting point from which to have that conversation, and every design or bit of engineering work that you do should reference this and make sure that you're ticking all of these boxes. Are they circulated around the room sufficiently now? Has everyone got one? Anyone missing one? Now on the first page it's got the broad stroke stuff, so 1.1, 1.2, etc. On the next 2 pages it breaks each of those down into different ways to actually demonstrate those. So it's the same list, except on the second and third page you've got sort of A, B and C level stuff. So have a look at that because it gives you a better idea of how to actually apply it. Alright, so let's have a look at this and break it down a little bit. Demonstrate integrity. So the first one is talking about things like being honest and trustworthy and having a good conscience when you're actually carrying out engineering work. Now that's your fundamental morals. That's the sort of stuff that most of you will be pretty familiar with, but in the context of how you actually apply that to engineering solutions, okay? So that's the first part. Part 2 is practicing competently, all right? So you as, let's say, a mechanical engineer, you might know a bit about civil engineering. But if you go out and pretend that you're a civil engineer or bid on a project saying that you know how to do all of the civil engineering stuff when you don't have those capabilities, that is poor ethics and that is going against this. So that's what that's talking about. When you actually practice as an engineer, you will have a particular area that you're able to practice within and areas that you're not. And you need to be very careful that when you're trying to solve problems for people that you're representing your own capabilities ethically, okay? Because otherwise they're going to rely on you for a solution and you might not, you might not be as able to actually deliver a safe solution if you haven't had that training. So I know full well that I'm unable to go and consult with Ergon Energy because I'm a mechanical engineer and there's absolutely almost nothing I can tell Ergon Energy that's going to be of any use to them. But if I rock up and say, yeah, I'm an engineer, I can totally do that, I'm going to electrocute someone. Or myself, probably more likely. But, so you've got to practice within your bounds and make sure that that is made clear to whoever you're working with. 3 is talking about leadership, but largely representing the profession well. So it's very important that if you, as an engineer, do the wrong thing, that not just sort of sullies your reputation, it actually sullies the reputation of engineers in general. And if you now are representing engineers in general poorly, that makes the people that are hiring you less likely to use engineers in the future, and there's a very good reason people hire engineers. It's that you guys have the capability to protect people, produce good long-term solutions and stop people dying when things go wrong. Because you've got the engineering in it that will prove that it won't go wrong. All right? So if someone's reluctant to use an engineer because they've had incredibly bad experiences with engineers, then you're more likely to have shoddy work done down the line and you're going to get people hurt. Not directly because you've done something wrong, but indirectly because you've now made them shy of engineers. And the last thing, sustainability. So it's within your ethics to be sustainable. So that's talking about what we talked on Monday. All right, so this sort of covers a really wide spectrum of how you conduct yourself as an engineer, and it's pretty important that you understand this code of ethics quite well. All right, so what we're going to do for the rest of the lecture, we're going to talk about some case studies. All right, you guys are going to have a bit of a chance to think about some engineering problems or some problems in general and how this particular code of ethics applies to them. And the first one's relatively close to my heart, and the reason that I use this is that I can talk about it with some amount of passion, I guess. It's not necessarily an engineering problem, but it's definitely an ethical problem, and you can start to think about where engineering might actually need ethics, because a lot of time you're talking about grey area. Grey area in the decisions that you can make, and also you need to understand all of the different factors involved when you're making design decisions or process decisions or where to put a pipeline or something like that. Okay? And so what I'm going to talk about is the Solomon Islands, and particularly the western province of the Solomon Islands, because I've got very close friends that have that live there and do a lot of really good work around that area. The reason that I'm going to talk about that is because if you think of, hands up who has any idea about the Solomon Islands? No familiarity whatsoever. Has anyone heard about the unrest that happened in Honiara about I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. No, you guys are probably all too young for that. Would downtown Honiara look like downtown Townsville, downtown Brisbane? What do you think Honiara looks like? No idea? It's a developing nation. So it's a developing Pacific nation, dirt roads, not a lot of road rules, not a lot of Western luxuries, put it that way. There's a couple of restaurants that you can get some really nice food, but fundamentally it's fairly basic. And then you go out from Honiara, and now we're talking about people living in villages, a very simple life, but very rewarding for those people, and there's a lot of really wonderful things going on in those villages as well. All right, but you as an engineer sitting in Townsville, if someone comes to you and says, all right, we're going to do something in the western province of the Solomon Islands, there's only a couple of villages there, you should be right. At this point, you have absolutely no understanding whatsoever of the people or the factors, the different dynamics of the environment, what actually is involved in acting ethically or not ethically within that environment. So I'm using this initial case study to kind of set that scene for you, and then we're going to think about it as if we had to do an engineering problem in that area, okay? Because a lot of you will be working in places that aren't Australia. All right, most of the engineers I graduated with ended up being pipeline engineers through this type of area around Southeast Asia, flying around in helicopters and making sure gas pipelines aren't bursting anywhere. So you will be working in these types of areas as engineers. You are international engineers once you graduate here. Your accreditation means you can get a job in most Western nations in the world and a lot of other ones as well. All right, so you can work anywhere. All right, so this is the Solomon Islands. It's over here. And we're talking about over here in New Georgia, so the Western Province, which is this. And so if you look very, very, very closely, there's a little island that's kind of elbow-shaped right there on the Morovo Lagoon, and that island's called Upi. All right, and that's where my friends live. All right, and this island, you can stand in the middle of it and see both bits of the ocean. So it's much, much smaller than Maggie Island. But these guys have a lot to do with the surrounding villages, and the reason that I talk about these guys is because they're probably the best example of good sustainable business practices and good ethics, so that's why I like highlighting it. But if you look at it, it's a very, very small place there compared to there, and you sort of see it in scale in respect to where we are. And this is kind of the pristine, untouched beauty that you have in many of these places in the world that you'll actually be operating as an engineer. So it's not just your standard, bit of an island, whatever. We're talking about pretty much untouched environment. This is about as far from civilization as you're going to get these days, short of somewhere in the middle of Africa or something like that. Yeah. To get there, you need to catch about 3 flights. One of them is a single-engine aircraft that lands on a grass airstrip, and then you need a 45-minute boat ride. So to get out of the place is quite difficult, and so if you were actually doing any sort of operations there, you can think of the logistics of actually getting that sort of equipment in as well. All right, so we're talking, there's me. There's a picture of my wife took. So we're talking about untouched reef, not coral bleaching sort of stuff that's going off the Great Barrier Reef, which is horrible. This is as untouched as you possibly go. The people like David Attenborough and the like go there whenever they want to take pictures of fish and make a video about them. Yeah. So this is a really beautiful area, and this is the type of thing that's catastrophic. If we stuff something up and ruin it, it's really ruined. It's about as untouched as it gets, so it's going to destroy it. There's a couple of other examples. There's a little fish guy. Swim with orcas. You can swim with orcas. You can swim with hammerheads. You can swim with just about every type of shark. What else? Sperm whales. Various other things. I swam with a manta ray that was bigger than the length of this table wide. So we're talking about really cool, untouched environment. And so this is the type of environment that we're trying to protect and we're trying to be ethical about. And then these are the people. So the local villages, they have a lot to do with the resort. All of the employees are from local villages. All of the food they source are from the local villages. They dive on the dive sites that are off the villages, so the reefs, and the village elders own the reefs, and so they pay for the right to dive on them and things like that, and we have a little bit to do and go and visit the villages. And so this is to sort of show, this is, I think, a hut that they cook in. This is the sorts of paths around the buildings, and that's their the river, and that's the kids running around, and that's their church slash school slash meeting area. And we went there and sort of distributed some lollies and things like that, and the kids love it. The people are the happiest people in the world. Absolute happiest people in the world. They live a beautiful existence of catching their food and growing their food and just, you know, being with their family and hanging out. It's simple by our Western standards, but it's just as valuable as every single one of your lives that you're likely to have. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, beautiful people, and not that familiar with things like, you know, engineering companies coming in and saying, hey, can we put a pipeline through there? And give them a bunch of money, and they're like, yeah, okay, whatever, that's fine. Then they're not familiar with the negative aspects of westernisation, and so in that respect they're relatively naive, which isn't a bad thing. It's just that us as engineers, it's on us to protect them. Just because they don't know better, because they haven't had the negative experiences that we would be familiar with, doesn't mean it's not on us to protect them with anything that we're doing. So when I read out the sustainability statement on Monday, when it said focusing particularly on the poorest nations or poorest people, that's what that particular statement means. Not that they're poor so we've got to look after them monetarily, but they might not be familiar with the way that Western culture is quite happy to use things up and spit them out and walk away. All right? And it's on us to actually protect that for people that aren't familiar with it. So that kind of brings me to the point of the whole setup and showing you some holiday pics, I guess. Logging. Logging has been a massive problem in the Solomon Islands for decades because they got lots of really beautiful timber, and how you actually get that timber, or should you get that timber? I mean, Brazil has massive problems around logging as well. Hands up who thinks logging's a good thing. Hands up who thinks logging's a bad thing. There we go. So some ambivalent people to logging. Hands up who's got timber in their house. Hands up who likes really nice wood grain furniture. Some of you like modern stuff, yeah? Hands up who likes guitars, yeah? So guitars are made out of some pretty special timber that often comes out of Brazilian forests and various other places. So there is a very specific purpose for logging. We need timber. Everyone needs timber. But there's ways to do it right and there's ways to do it wrong. And in the Solomon Islands, for decades, they've had a lot of predominantly Chinese logging companies come in and strip logging the entire place. And so that's sort of a little logging village. That's kind of what they set up to get the logs out. And that's what's left. So you would have imagined that this island would have been covered in, you know, forest, and it is not anymore. And so the result of that is that the trees don't grow back, and you lose a lot of the soil, and you get a lot of runoff, and you get a lot of chemicals, and you get a lot of this happening in the waterways. And just kind of contrast that with the picture of the beautiful pristine reef that I showed you a minute ago. All right, so that's a really negative way to carry out that logging. And these companies come in, and to the villages they say, hey, we'll give you $5,000, $10,000, whatever. Can we go and log this bit? It's not really yours. You're not really using it. Can we log it? And they're like, yeah, fine. That's more money than they would have seen in their entire lives. So, you know, if these guys are doing carvings and working with, you know, selling food and things like that, they might be making a couple of dollars a day. All right, so you come in and offer someone like, you know, a village like that survives very happily on that amount of money, but you offer them, you know, more money than they will ever see in their entire lifetime, and they'll be like, yeah, absolutely, go for it. But they don't realise that what they're left with is this, and what they're left with where they actually catch their food is that. Okay, so that's a really negative way to do it, and it's been a big problem in the area for many, many years. And so the guys at UPI particularly are trying to do something about it, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the sorts of environmental impacts you have are the ecosystem, forest regrowth, and think about not just the people but also the animals, birds, all of that kind of stuff that live in the region. Runoff and water quality and affecting the fisheries, the reef. The reef is both for food and also tourism and various other factors, and the pollution from the machinery. So there's all these impacts that are really negative on the environment. Social impacts. Well, if you can no longer fish or grow food that you were then selling to some of the, resorts or other people, other villages, things like that, then your livelihood is gone. You get a one-off windfall payment, and on the face of it, that sounds like a great thing, but if you're used to making $1 a day and you now are a village elder and you've got $50,000 to spend, and you've never heard anything about wise saving and investing and using money wisely, what are you going to do with that $50,000? Yeah, you could blow it all on many things. I mean, they're unfamiliar with the idea of what to do with it. You might buy a nice boat, you might go and have a party, who knows? So in some circumstances they can use it very wisely, in some circumstances it can be a bit of a problem, but that one-off windfall payment isn't a good thing. It can be quite tricky. And the other thing is, now you've got a couple of people that are the perhaps elders of the village in charge of all this money, and then you've got all of these other people in the village that are like, all right, well, I want some of that money too. I want a decision on where that goes. And so you start to put a massive wedge between people as they fight over this. Money's oftentimes a bad thing in our society. It can be just as bad thing in any other society. All right, so that's actually a really negative social impact on the people and the way that they actually carry out, their day-to-day lives. And that can have a cultural impact. It can have a cultural impact because firstly, you've got, all of that social issues going on, but also you've now changed the way that they have to feed themselves, you've changed their local environment, you've changed a lot of different things. So you've got a lot of potential impacts there as a result of simply giving someone some money and going in and taking their trees. All right, so you've got a code of ethics in front of you. What I'd like you to do is discuss the operation of that type of logging in terms of the EA code of ethics and which particular points apply, or more importantly, which points are being contravened. So which points are being violated in this code of ethics. So read through the ethics again, think about the logging process, talk amongst yourselves, write down 2 or 3 dot points, or you can circle it on the page or write a little note on it. But start to think about how the code of ethics actually applies to this particular situation. All right, has everyone had a bit of a chance to discuss that now? Cool. All right, so which particular points do you think are being violated in those logging practices? Anyone? Pretty much everything related to sustainability? Engage responsibly? Yeah, well, pretty much. More specific in how it applies? Accept as well as give honest and fair criticism. Is that a level A, B, C? 1.2. So be honest and trustworthy. So how are you not being honest or trustworthy in that circumstance? Yeah. You're not being clear about the implications of the decisions that they're making. That's right, exactly. So that's definitely what did we say? 1.2, be honest and trustworthy. What else?
1.3, respectful dignity.
Yeah.
Have like sacred places or places that they're claiming, like rituals or something, and if you don't ask them about it, communicate with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're not respecting their dignity, coming in there and basically treating the land terribly, treating the people terribly, and potentially not understanding the way that they're actually using their environment, because they use their environment far more sustainably and sensibly than we use our environments. So if we go in there with a Western idea of they sit in their house and then they pop out to Woolies to feed themselves, so we can trash this area over here, that's very naive of us. And so we need to respect those people's dignity and particularly the way that they live their lives. And so you need to understand it in the actual process before you go in and take any action. Anything else?
Just like on what you were saying, 2.3, you don't have adequate knowledge of what's happening on there, and you're kind of relying on them not having adequate knowledge of what you're actually going to do to the island.
Yeah, absolutely. So you don't perhaps have an adequate knowledge of the people and the environment, and you're not allowing them to have an adequate knowledge of what you're actually going to do to it, which is quite important as well. What else? Anyone else?
3.3 like provide clear line of communication on issues such as engineering services costs, outcomes, and risks. So just kind of risk involved, so you're not telling them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're not communicating what's actually happening to the people, and so that's also hitting that 3.3 mark.
3.1. You're really punishing the willingness of engineers or people to benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're engineers, and we're talking about logging, so I doubt many of you will go into logging engineering, but if we're talking about an actual engineering project that's having the same effect, you're really sullying the name of engineers. If you've gone in there and effectively kind of pulled the wool over their eyes and then just trashed their environment and walked off, it's not just necessarily the village that's going to have a really bad opinion of engineers, but that word, that information will probably filter through the villages and back to potentially someone that has connections in the government or local government, and then that information is going to filter back, and so potentially the nation would stop cooperating with at least your company, if not engineers in general. Now, that's not necessarily been the experience in the Solomon Islands because of various reasons that you can understand, but certainly you don't want to damage engineering in general, and it doesn't matter whether your company says we've been doing it for 20 years, if it ticks your box, that's fine. If it doesn't, then that's where you draw the line. And this is a really difficult thing to do, because you can imagine if a company asks you to do something and you say no, you probably don't have a job. But at some point, as an engineer, you've got to be willing to lose your job if it's between that and making a really impactful decision. I mean, reflect on, in 20 years, you look back on the job you did, and if you can't be proud of what you've actually achieved as an engineer, if you still think back about how you destroyed those poor people's village and water and wrecked the environment, no amount of money now is going to be worth the regret that you have then. All right, so in some circumstances, it's worth losing your job if you're asked to do something that's grossly unethical. Okay? But you as an engineer can then hold this up at their next job and say, when they ask you the question, why did you leave your last job or why did you lose your last job? You say, I referred to the code of ethics. What they were asking me to do was grossly unethical, and so I chose not to. And in most circumstances, that will actually be an asset. All right? There's very few circumstances where losing your job can be an asset, but that's one of them. Okay? So you have a code there to actually reference. All right, has anyone got any other points? I mean, you can pretty much go through each one of these and work out how one of them applies in some circumstance or other, because this is a pretty cut and dry, horrible thing to be doing. All right. So I asked you, do you like logging at the very beginning? Hopefully you like logging even less now. But there are sustainable ways of felling timber that actually tick a lot of our ethical boxes, they tick a lot of our sustainability boxes and a lot of other things. So the family that I talked about that live at Upi, they've spun out a couple of things. One is a massive medical foundation, so they built an operating theatre in the area, and it's the only one in the bloody southern hemisphere other than Australia or something rubbish like that. They're doing a lot of really good medical stuff, they're doing a lot of good schooling stuff, and they've spun out this company. It's called the Morovo Lagoon Sustainable Timber. And the way that actually works is that they go and they empower the villagers to cut down their own timber. They teach them how to fell timber or fell logs sustainably, so take 1 out of 10 of a particular tree, replant, that kind of stuff. They've taught them how to actually process the own timber, and then they provide this timber to the company, and then the guys at Upi export it. All right? Greenpeace has estimated that the amount of money that the villagers earn as a result of this sustainable timber process is 10 times what they'd make using that other option of just knock down the trees and pay you some money. So they're making 10 times more money doing this. It's over effectively their lifetimes rather than a single windfall payment. It's protecting the environment, it's providing timber that people actually pay a hell of a lot more money for, because if you can sell certified sustainable timber, you make a lot more money than if you're selling just standard timber. So they certify this as sustainable timber, and so they can sell it for a much higher profit as well. And so you're still doing logging, everyone's still getting their beautiful timber. The villagers now, however, have a far happier life. They haven't destroyed their environment, they've actually got jobs, and they can sort of continue doing that and pass that on to their children as well. Okay? So that's a way that you can actually get the timber, but in a sustainable and ethical way. And the only way that they were able to do that was to understand the way the villages work and what will and won't work for their actual cultural sort of importance. Non-profit. So the hospital stuff, they have about 20 doctors from across Australia and America go over there on medical visits roughly about 4 times a year. And they do like a 2-week long clinic. And all of those doctors, funnily enough, back in their own practices are very high up and know all of the millionaires, and so all of the millionaires want to support them doing it, so they bring all of that money over. And so the doctors love it because it's fundamental medicine. They don't have CT scans you can whip someone off to. You just have to actually diagnose them on the spot. And they get a lot of that money to do that. With the sustainable timber, they bankrolled it themselves, and then they're making a profit from the timber. So that's relatively, again, once again, non-profit. But by working in that area, they're not working to become millionaires, they're working to make a massive difference. And this has impacted that entire Western Province region. All of the villages around there are having massive advantage from the work that these guys are doing. But this logging example is just one example of the sorts of things you can do when you understand a people and when you actually go and listen to people about what they want to achieve. Alright, so that's not engineering really, logging. But this is the type of villages, this is the type of people, the way that the sorts of people that you'll be dealing with live if you're dealing with putting new gas pipelines through that area. There is a lot of oil and gas and all good resources that we like using around there, but you have to put pipelines through people's reefs and through people's homes effectively to get from A to B. Alright, so just spend a minute thinking about you as a pipeline engineer, how you would actually deal with those people, and come up with, I haven't said there, let's come up with 2 of these, identify how you will actually do a good job of them, okay, for some sort of pipeline through that type of area. It seems like everyone's running out of puff, so let's just hit a couple of these. Has anyone got a particular area of this where they have a bit of a criteria or a guideline such that we adhere to this and still can achieve that? Anyone? Sorry? Seek peer review of what you're doing. So which one of these does that hit? Yeah, so maintaining and developing knowledge and skills, so you might actually want to learn as much as you can about the environment before you make any decisions, and certainly consult with others about that. Anyone else? 1.2, so what are we doing in 1.2? Okay, so you organise a bunch of meetings with the village and communicate clearly what process you need to do, what potential impacts there are, so that Yeah, so they can make an informed decision and potentially inform your decision based on it as well. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, absolutely. So they can tell you what areas are absolutely no-go zones and what areas you could possibly work in. Any others? Is there one there? No? Yep. Everyone's health and safety. So what sort of health and safety practices and regulations do you think there are in the Solomon Islands? Very stringent ones? Probably not. Now, what sort of health and safety regulations and environmental protection regulations do we have in Australia? Relatively strict ones. Now, you as a company working out of Australia, oftentimes your company will make a decision based on this, that you're going to adhere to the Australian regulations irrespective of the regulations of the land you're working in. And that's always a very good place to start. And so in terms of exactly what you said, putting a criteria against this, we want to adhere to that. We want to make sure we don't have impact on the people or the environment. And the way to do that might be to implement Australian regulations in the Solomon Islands because we are an Australian company or whatever. Okay? So that's one way of very clearly achieving that.
With the security, maybe reach out to an engineer that's worked with them before?
Yep, absolutely.
The communication gap?
Yeah. Yeah, so that and potentially even further than that, what other examples of pipelines going through a village or a Southeast Asian island nation, what other pipelines have gone in? There will have been hundreds. What experiences did those companies have working with the locals? Which one seemed to do it the best, or what would best practice be described as in terms of working with those people? So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There will have been people that have done a good job, and there will have been people that have done a really shitty job in the past. And so you can actually track down that information and work out what you think best practice is and follow what they came up with. So that's a good one. Any other ones before we finish? One last one?
4.2 and 4.1 work together with informing the people of the village what the consequences are. Then they're concerned, you have to inform your employer of what they want done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so so what was that? That was 1.2 and 4.1. Yeah, so being honest and engaging responsibly with the community go hand in hand, because responsible engagement is being honest and all the rest of it. Yeah. All right, so just hold up. I've got a couple of last slides and then we're finished. So we're talking about this hypothetical village out in the middle of the Pacific that we don't really have a lot of familiarity with. Who's familiar with coal seam gas? Everyone. So now you're an engineer and you're tasked with going and putting in a gas pumping station on a property out west, and the farmer really doesn't want you there. How do you actually do that ethically? Yeah, I'm not going to ask you, I'm going to leave that as a thought for tonight, but think about these points in the Code of Ethics and how that actually applies to all of the arguments and court battles and protests that you're hearing about coal seam gas. Because there are a lot of advantages to coal seam gas. There are some companies doing it very well, which is engaging with the farmers, only working with those that are willing to have it on their land, paying them what they deserve for it. And some people being very irresponsible, working to the letter of the law, which is you can go out and take regardless of what the farmer says. All right? And so there's different ways of doing it, but think about our Code of Ethics as it applies to coal seam gas, because that's something that potentially you guys will be working with in the very near future. Last thing, Engineering Your Future, there's a chapter on ethics in this textbook. I haven't specified this textbook as required for this subject because I think you guys have better uses for $120. All right? The one thing that anyone ever uses out of this textbook is the ethics chapter, and funnily enough, within copyright laws, we're allowed to PDF one chapter and give it to you guys for free. And so the one chapter that I'm giving you is the ethics chapter in this textbook. It's very well worth a read. Okay? So that's on LearnJCU now. Have a read of that for homework, and I'll see you next week. I'll send you out an email with exactly what's going to be on the quiz next Wednesday. All right? So just keep across that.